Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Chapter 5, Halacha 3 in Kilayim, and the art scroll we're on 48b1, and today we're getting into the intrinsic nature of the work area of the vineyard. There's going to be a three-way debate here between Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, Rabbi Lazar, and also the sages. And really what this is going to be drilling down, that why did Rebbe put this three-way malokit into the Mishnah? Because it really drills down to a subtlety about the nature of this work area, the nature of these 4 amos setbacks that we've been dealing with, something that we wouldn't have known without this Mishnah and set of Gemaras, and the nature of it. It really is going to give us a new understanding about how to think of the vineyard. The Mishnah that's going to be coming up is going to deal with the permissibility of planting foreign seeds inside of the vineyard. And we know that, if, so far we've been dealing with what happens if you're going to plant where you have a vineyard here and then, over there you have a vineyard over there, and you want to know about separations. We got a little bit into that where we had the burnt out vineyard, but now we're really inside of the vineyard getting into partitions and planting within this vineyard itself. But this is really here to teach us about the nature of this work area. The Mishnah says regarding a ditch that passes through a vineyard that is 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide. Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov says that if it cuts through from one end of the vineyard to the other end, then it appears like an independent domain situated in between 2 vineyards, and you can sow foreign seed inside of that ditch. But, says the Mishnah, if it does not cut through the entire vineyard, then it is treated like a wine press dug out in the middle of a vineyard, which may not be sown with foreign seed. Now, it's going to look like the Tanaim are going to, the Tanna Kama is going to agree with that, right? And really, what is going to be the position of, a partially dug out wine press? That's going to be the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is going to be saying that, look, you've made a partition in the ground that is its own makom. It's 4 tefachim deep, 4 tefachim wide. It's going to be like a fence. And inside of that area, very good that it's surrounded by a vineyard, but it's going to be like its own makom. That's the position of Rabbi Eliezer, the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, I know it's confusing because there's a Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Lazar, but anyway, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's point is different. He's saying it's not its own makom. It has to run through this ditch has to run through the entire vineyard, so it looks like it splits it apart. Now, the Tanna Kama will agree that, that's a kosher separation. You can plant within it. But they're going to bring up a nuance here about what happens if it partially is going through and the issues about that. And in one of the cases, Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov will agree that you can plant within it, and the Tanna Kama are going to say that you cannot. And that is going to be the difference. So in some way, actually, Rabbi Eliezer has the lenient position here, which is not usual to see. And the Tanna Kama is going to have the most strict opinion. Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov is really going to be in the middle. And the halacha is going to be like what the sages say. Now, the idea is that this is cutting through the entire thing, and you're planting foreign seed inside of it. There's no setbacks. Why? Because if you're going through the entire strip, in other words, you've cut through a work area and you've split this vineyard into 2 halves, everybody is going to agree that you can plant within it. There's no malokit there. Even Rabbi Eliezer is going to agree that you can plant within it. Rabbi Eliezer's point is, no, you can plant within a smaller one. And even the sages will say, yes, you've split this into 2 independent domains. So like if you have 9 vines on this side of the ditch and 9 vines on that side of the ditch, and they're organized in 3 rows of 3, and you cut through a work area to split it into 9 and 9, did you separate this? Yes, it just looks like on this side of the ditch you have a different vineyard, and that side of the ditch you had a different vineyard. Maybe it was 18 before, but now it's 9. Now, the Mishnah is going to get the case of the wine press, and it's going to clarify the status that it's actually going to be the subject of a Tanaic dispute. And it's going to say regarding a wine press that is dug out inside of the vineyard, and that is 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide, that you may sow foreign seed with it. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer, but the sages forbid planting inside of it. Now, we know that in other Masechtot, like in Eruvin and also in Masechet Shabbos and in Sukkos, that 4 by 4 tefachim and also 10 tefachim deep, that is going to be the situation for saying, oh, this is now its own makom. And, there's a lot of halachot where you're dealing with something that's 10 tefachim high and 4 by 4, or 10 tefachim deep and 4 by 4. And so now this is also applying with Kilayim, and he's basically saying that it's going to be its own makom. But the subtlety of the sages of why they're going to forbid that is because you've cut through the work area. And the work area itself is going to be the issue because it's surrounded on multiple sides, on 2 sides by other work areas, and it's surrounded on 2 sides by other vines. So that's going to be the nature of why the Tanna Kama is going to forbid it. Now, something very, very related in this Mishnah, it's going to talk about a lookout mound inside of a vineyard, and this is going to be where they pile up dirt inside of the vineyard so the watchman can sit there and look out. And the case is going to go where if it's going to be 10 tefachim high and 4 by 4 tefachim wide, that's going to be the minimum measure, that one may sow foreign seed inside of it, in other words, on top of it. But if there were intermingling branches, in other words, the branches of the vines are going to be on the, around it and, coming onto the mound and mixing and connecting, the Mishnah says it's forbidden to plant on the lookout mound. So the idea is that if the surrounding branches, according to the Rosh, are going to be intermingling over the mound and surrounding it, then it's going to be forbidden. That's the Rosh. The Rambam is going to be saying that these branches, it's just enough for them to touch the top of the mound, and they're going to nullify the partition created by the walls of the mound, since the mound now appears to be part of the surrounding vineyard. And the idea is that now it's going to look like part of the vineyard, so no foreign seed can be planted in it. And the law of intermingling branches is relevant only with the respect of planting on the sections of the mound that are not directly beneath the branches, and planting directly beneath branches is going to be forbidden, says the Chazan Ish, even if the branches are not intermingled and are not touching the mound. So the intermingled branches is a halacha that comes up many times. If you have intermingling branches, can you plant underneath those branches? Answer is no. It's going to be a Kilayim issue. And what if the setback from the base of the tree, the trunk of the tree, is going to be more than 4 amos, but the branches are going to be trailing away because of their vines? Can you plant underneath the vines? Let's say the vines are 5 amos away. Can you plant under them? No, it's going to be the law of the intermingling branches. And so what the Chazan Ish is pointing out is that even if it's up on this mound and the branches are now surrounding the mound, like what the Rosh's case is, could you plant under there? No, it's the case of the intermingling vine. Now, the Mishnah is going to go into the next part. It's going to say regarding a grapevine that is planted inside a dugout, a wine press, or inside of a cleft in the ground. We give the grapevine its 6 tefach work area in which no foreign seed can be planted, and one can plant the remainder of the wine press or cleft. Here's how this works. So you have a wine press, and this now is inside of the ground. And somebody, for whatever reason, planted one vine inside of that vine. Now, what is this wine cleft, this wine vat or cleft? This is going to be 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide minimum. And so they want to know, within this, is this going to be like a fence where you can't plant something else? In other words, if you have a fence within a field, there's only one thing that you can plant inside of that fence. But this is teaching us something a little bit different. This is saying that if somebody dug out a wine press inside of the ground and there's one grapevine, can you plant something else inside of there? The answer is going to be yes. But why does that work? Well, because the setback for a grapevine, when it's just an individual vine, is going to be a 6 tefachim work area, and you can't put any foreign seed inside of that, but the rest of the wine press can be planted with something else as long as the setbacks are there. Now, there's going to be a dissent. Rabbi Yossi says that if there are not 4 amos by 4 amos inside of the wine press or cleft, one may not introduce foreign seed there at all. So 4 amos by 4 amos, this is also something that comes up in Masechet Sukkot. That's going to be the minimum size of a sukkah for how wide something can be. And over here, he's basically saying that this is going to be where it has to have, at least 10 tefachim deep, but 4 by 4 for Amot to be its own makom. And unless it's going to have enough where it has the status of its own makom, then you can't plant within it. In other words, he's saying that the 4 by 4 tefach interior, even though it's confined, it's going to be too close because it's going to be where it's not really a legal partition in terms of distancing, and it's going to give the appearance of being closed in, and you're not allowed to close in vines. So Rabbi Yossi is basically arguing that unless the wine press is at least 4 amos by 4 amos, you can't plant it at all with foreign seed. But if it's going to be more than 4 amos by 4 amos or 4 amos by 4 amos, then foreign seed can be planted 6 tefachim away from that grapevine. Now, Rabbi Yossi is basically saying, says the Rosh Rilio, that any enclosure smaller than 4 amos by 4 amos becomes subordinate to the vine, and it's prohibited for foreign seed. Now, that, by the way, is going to be similar to cases with the law of the vineyard perimeter. And it was taught about, what happens where there's a wall and your vineyard is there, and then the space. And, basically, the question is that area going to be subordinate to the vineyard and, can't be planted at all? And then if it's going to be larger than that measure, then only the vineyard's 4 amma work area is going to be prohibited. And basically the same over here, that a confined space like a wine press that has a vine may not be planted with foreign seed if it lacks the minimum size of 4 by 4 amos, according to Rabbi Yossi. And that's where you can plant the vine inside and other things, but there still has to be a 6 tefach setback. Now, final part of this, Mishnah says that regarding a house that is inside of a vineyard, one can plant foreign seed inside of that house. Now, since the 4 walls of the house are going to separate the space, make it its own makom, then you're going to have basically a vineyard outside of the house, and within the walls, you're going to have its own makom, and you can plant foreign seed inside of that house. So the walls of the house are going to be similar to the walls of a lookout mound, which is why they're put together, and the spaces within to try to create different makoms is going to be similar even to the dugout ditch that you're going to try to plant within. So it's very fitting that Rebbe put all of these together. The Gemara is going to get into Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov's statement, and that is basically where he's saying that the ditch runs through the entire vineyard, and it splits 2 vineyards in half, and on both sides are going to be halachic vineyards. It goes through a work area, and you can plant within there. Now, keep in mind, everybody is going to agree that you could plant within there, but the subtlety comes on what happens if you have a smaller area than that. So the question that the Gemara starts off saying, does Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov not permit planting inside of the ditch unless the ditch cuts through the vineyard and the 4 amma work area, or is it enough for the ditch to cut through the vineyard without cutting through the 4 amma work area? So that's really where we're going with this. What is the nature of this work area? What's the nature of this 4 amma setback? And the Chazan Ish is going to explain this like this. Inasmuch as the 4 amma work area surrounding the vineyard is deemed part of the vineyard, perhaps only a ditch that cuts through the vineyard and is 4 amma work area on both sides will divide the vineyard into 2 distinct areas and will be considered an independent domain in between the 2 vineyards. And then it will be permitted for planting. But if, however, it cuts only through the vineyard itself and not through the work area, it does not divide the vineyard into two distinct areas, and then you would just have a ditch inside of a vineyard that cannot be planted with foreign seed. And he continues and says, on the other hand, perhaps once the ditch cuts through the entire vineyard itself, it would be enough to divide it into smaller vineyards. And even if it does not cut through the adjoining 4-amma work area, and for this purpose, the 4-amma work area may not be viewed as part of the actual vineyard. And that's really the point of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. He's saying that the 4-amma work area is not viewed as part of the vineyard. The Tanna Kama are saying that it is viewed as part of the vineyard. And so this ground that you've been learning about with setbacks is basically an intricate part of the vineyard. That's the view of the Tanna Kama. The position of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov is basically saying that that ground itself, the 4-amma area, that really it's just the vines that are the vineyard, and this 4-amma work area is not part of the vineyard. That's going to be the crux of this argument. So the Gemara is going to try to go into this, and it's going to say that this question can be resolved from that which was taught in a Beraisa regarding the dissenting view of the ditches, who forbid planting in a ditch that cuts through a vineyard. And the Mara Fulda explains about this, that the sages are arguing with Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov and prohibiting planting inside of the ditch. That's also apparent from the Mishnah, which records the leniency as the personal opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, rather than an anonymous ruling by everybody. And the Gemara is going to say that the sages concede to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov in the case of a ditch that cuts through the entire vineyard and the 4-amma work area, that it's allowed to sow the ditch with foreign seed. Now, that's going to be the position that everybody's going to agree about. Everybody's going to agree, there's no argument. You run through the entire vineyard with a ditch, that's going to be 10 tefachim by 4 tefach wide, and everybody's going to agree you can plant within it. But the question comes, what happens if the orientation's different and it's going to be smaller? Then what's going to happen? Or it doesn't cut through all of the vines, or the vines that it does cut through doesn't make it into two different vineyards. Then what? So the Gemara continues and says, it is evident from this that Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov himself maintains that even though it does not cut through the vineyard and the 4-amma work area, but only through the vineyard itself, it is permitted to plant inside of the ditch. So Mara Fulda says that if Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov would permit sowing the ditch only when it cuts through the vineyard and the work area, then there'd be no dispute with the Tanaim. And this is going to be the basis for this maloket. And where is it that Rabbi Elazar and ben Yaakov and the sages are going to disagree? Because again, the sages are going to cede to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov in part of this case. They're going to agree with him, but not everywhere. And the Gemara says, where do they disagree? And they say it's regarding a case where there were 2 rows of vines on this side of the ditch and 2 rows of vines on that side of the ditch, such that there's a complete 2-row vineyard on each side of the ditch. So the Mara Fulda says that, we learned before that a legal vineyard consists of at least 2 rows of vines. And the sages are contending that if the ditch does not cut through the work area on both sides, it's prohibited for planting foreign seeds, since it's surrounded on 2 sides by 2-row vineyards. And what would be that third side of the vineyard? It's going to be the land of the work area. That's the problem. So in the case over here, they're saying, look, if you run through the entire work area and split everything in half, everybody agrees there's no problem. Where is the problem? The problem comes, well, what is the nature of this work area? Is this part of the vineyard or not? And so they're pointing out that, look, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov is saying that the ditch is prohibited only if it's going to be surrounded on 3 sides by the vineyard, but not by the work area. In other words, they're saying, like, look, if the middle point is going to be vines, and let's say, there's vines there, and, it cuts through an area and organizes itself so that on the left side there are vines, on the right side there are vines, and on the third side there's some vines there. Then they're saying that basically you are not allowed to do that. That's why Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says you have to run through the entire vineyard. Tanakama says, no, wait a second. If you have a halachic vineyard on the left side with this ditch, and you have a halachic vineyard on the right side with this ditch, and you didn't cut through the entire rest of the vineyard, so there's more vines laying, if you kept going on, with this ditch, there's, continuing to be vines. But where's this ditch cutting through? It's not cutting through where there were vines. It's cutting through where it's ground. It's the work area. And so what's on this third side of the ditch? Not more vines, not another vine. It's the work area itself. And that work area itself, they're saying, is part of the vineyard. And now what did you do? You didn't create its own makom. It's not a partition. That it's surrounded on three sides by vines. And basically what they're going to be saying is that the ground itself is part of the work area, and that's what makes it prohibited. So the difference really between Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov and the sages is Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov is going to be saying that, look, if I've cut through vines, okay, and I've laid out this ditch and I've tore up vines, and on the left of this ditch and the right of this ditch are vines, and both sides are going to be vineyards. And if I kept going, but I stopped, okay, and I didn't run through the entire vineyard, and what's going to be there right now? There's going to be a vine. There's a vine in the way. It's not empty ground that's a 4-amma work area. It's a vine. He's going to be saying you can't do that, and that's why you have to continue to rip up everything and run right through the entire vineyard. And the sages are saying, look, you can't orient this ditch where you're going to run through part of the vineyard, and on the left side are going to be vines and the right side are the vines. And where did you run through it? You didn't tear up any vines. You just ran this through the work area, and you didn't finish to run through the entire vineyard, and you stopped. And so if you continued, you would split everything up and there would be no problem by anybody. Everybody would agree there was no problem. But you stopped. You didn't continue running through. And what happens? Now there's ground there on that third side. It's empty. You're right. And, to the left and right of that ground are going to be vines. But what they're saying is that is a vineyard. The ground itself is a vineyard. And that's the key point. Now, the Gemara is going to qualify the dispute between Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov and the sages. And it's going to get into more points about it. And the Gemara is going to cite a brisa that elaborates on the law of the ditch that cuts through the vineyard, but not through the 4-amma work area. And they say that it was taught in a brisa, if the size of the ditch is less than this, it is forbidden to plant foreign seed. Now, why is this in here? This is a very curious brisa, and it's kind of like a big question mark why this is. And the Gemara is going to answer it. Now, initially, you would look at this as saying that, well, maybe if the ditch is going to be less than 10 tefachim, like 9 tefachim, that you can't sow it with foreign seed. And, then it would look like the brisa is not elaborating the position of Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, but because that says in the Mishnah that it's going to be 10 tefachim. And so then it would look like it's going to be a brisa supporting the sages. So then maybe it would look like, the sages are going to be lenient, and Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov is going to be strict, and that they'll be saying, well, the sages say that, the ditch just can be like 9 tefachim or 7 tefachim deep, and Rabbi Lazar is the one who's saying you have to run through the whole thing, but it has to at least be 10 tefachim deep. But that's not why this brisa is here, and that's not what this brisa says. And the Gemara says, had the brisa not taught this, why might we have said? Would anybody really think that the sages are going to allow planting in a ditch when it's less than 10 tefachim deep? And it's going to say if a ditch that's going to be 10 tefachim deep is going to be forbidden according to the sages, then when it does not cut through the vineyard's work area, is a 9 tefach deep ditch not surely also going to be forbidden? So why is this brisa here to teach something that seems so obvious? What's the deeper point? The Pnei Moshe is going to put this together. He's going to say that if even a 10 tefach deep ditch does not divide the vineyard according to the sages, why? Because it does not cut through the vineyard's work area. And that's the point. It has to cut through all of the work area. Then a ditch that is less deep and also does not cut through the work area will surely not divide the vineyard. That's the deeper point. Now, the Gemara is going to conclude, and it's going to say that rather, what is the brisa referring to when it says less than this? It refers to the ditch's 4 tefach width. And that's teaching that if the ditch is less than 4 tefachim wide, it is forbidden to plant foreign seed inside of it. And this is teaching us that it's necessary, because if the Brisa did not teach us this, what could we have said? We could have said that the ditch should be considered as though if it were sealed, and it would be allowed to plant foreign seed inside of it. So to preclude this and to say that if a ditch is narrower than 4 tefachim, it's forbidden to sow foreign seed inside of it. And basically the novelty here, according to the Tanaim, is that although Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov specifically mentions that he permits planting in a 4 tefach wide ditch, he may not mean to exclude a narrower ditch. And to the contrary, you might think that the law of a narrower ditch is even more lenient. And the Gemara is there to teach you that basically everybody's agreeing about the sizing here, right? Why is this price in here, right? Because it's really supporting what the Mishnah said. The Mishnah is not the opinion of Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov. And you might say, well, he says it's 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide. And you might have said, well, wait a second, maybe the sages are going to say that something that's a little narrower will be fine, or something that's a little bit deeper will be fine. Or perhaps, the Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov might say that something a little bit narrower can be fine. And so really what you have is you have it where this is in here to say that, no, both of them agree that the minimum size is 4 by 10. And so that because the halacha is not like Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, this is in here to say that, well, Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov says this, but the sages say this too. And that's so that we're not sitting there wondering, well, maybe you can run a ditch through the entire vineyard, and if it's 9 tefachim deep, it'll be okay by the sages, but not okay by Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov. And, we know that the Tanna Kama is going to be like them. So, 9 tefach deep ditches. And then really this Bryce is here to say that, no, that there's a different reason why there's a mloket between Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, but it's not by the 10 by 4. That they both agree on the measurements for the depth. The issue that's going to be there is going to be in this layout of where you put this ditch. And on the third side, if there are vines, that's going to be forbidden by Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov. And if you put it in the work where it's going through the work area, that's going to be allowed by Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, because he's going to say that that work area is not part of the vineyard. But the sages are going to forbid that. They're going to forbid on the third side where there's going to be a vine there, and they're also going to forbid where there's dirt there as part of that 4 amma work area. And that's why they're saying, look, just run it through the entire thing. And the sages would agree, yeah, you can plant in there, right? But that's, again, what happens if it's going to be shorter than that. Now, the Gemara is going to continue this, and it's going to ask a question, and it's going to say, let the ditch indeed be considered as though it were sealed and permitted for planting, and were it not taught in a brisa as follows. And this is going to follow the Vilna Goan's explanation, and it's going to say, regarding roots of madder, madder is a plant used for dye, and that enter within the 4 amma work area of a vineyard. If they have entered the area at a depth of more than 3 tefachim beneath the ground, they are permitted. So why then does the Brisa state that a ditch less than 4 tefachim wide is going to be forbidden for planting, and a ditch would be considered sealed where it's going to be more than 3 tefachim deep, that it should be permitted for planting? And this is going to get into brilliant 3-dimensional chess here, because later on in Kilayim, in chapter 6, Halacha 2, 57b in the art scroll, basically it's going to be dealing with this other plant that's used just for the roots, and that's the only thing that they're using in the plant is the root, and they're using it for dye. That's what you're harvesting. That's what you want. You don't want anything else from that plant. What are you going to use dyes for? Well, clothing, also for marking animals, also for marking things. Anyway, dye had a premium, and in fact, one of the earliest crops for civilization was safflower, because it was used to make a orangey yellow dye. Anyway, today it's used for oil, but in the old days it was really used for dyes, and madder is one of these. Now, madder is going to be planted under the ground, and what's novel about this is that if you're planting things more than 3 tefachim beneath the ground, it counts as its own makom. So you might have some wheat on top of the ground, or you might have a vineyard on top of the ground, and you have next to it in this ditch or in this other area, you have madder that's there more than 3 tefachim under the ground. That counts as its own space. Are they going to be Kilayim with one another? They're not going to be Kilayim with one another. And that's really the novelty about this, and it's the brilliancy of this. And the Gemara says that in our case of a ditch less than 4 tefachim wide, that would be different because since the ditch is not actually sealed, the airspace of the vineyard encircles the foreign seed planted inside and prohibits it. And the idea, says the Vilna Goan, is that the roots of madder are totally hidden from the vineyard surface. Why? By at least 3 tefachim of ground above it. And so because it is surrounded by a vineyard, but buried and nobody can see it, it does not constitute Kilayim. So what do you have here? You have a field within a field, except that this field can't be seen. And in the case of the ditch, that can be seen. And that's why the measurements have to be a certain size. It's not enough just to plant something inside and say that it's its own makom and it has its own spacing, like if you have a house or you have a sukkah or an area for Shabbat. No, this is saying that these are the minimum sizes. It has to at least be that. And it's saying it's not like the case of the madder where you're just putting something into a different area, that the case of the madder is like, no, this is really its own field under the ground, and it's not Kilayim because it is buried, and you can't see it, and you're only harvesting the roots of the madder for the dye, and the grapes are going to be above it. And in the case of the ditch, that it's open air, and everybody can see what you're growing in it. That's why it really does need to be its own makom. So the Mishnah talks about the next part. We're going to get into the argument by Rabbi Lazar, and really the question now that is going to go is, well, what really is the difference between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? So regarding a wine press, says the Mishnah, that is dug out inside of a vineyard that is 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide, that you can plant foreign seed within it. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer, but the sages forbid it. Now, we just learned something, right? We just learned that, well, wait a second. The sages are, and Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, both care about what happens on the third side of this pit and this well that you're digging in. And so Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov is saying, well, if there are vines there, then it's going to be forbidden because you didn't cut through it, and it's surrounded on 3 sides by vines. And the sages are saying not only that, they would agree with that. They would say not only that, but the ground itself, if it's cutting through the ground and not cutting through any vines, and that ground there is part of a 4 amma work area, that ground is part of the vineyard as well, and that is surrounded by vineyard on 3 sides. Even though there's not a vine on the third side, the work area is like a vine. That's the deep, amazing, nuanced position of the sages. Rabbi Lazar takes the more lenient approach. He just says, look, the pit itself is its own makom, and it's its own independent space, and it doesn't matter what's happening on 3 or 4 sides of this, that you could do whatever you want inside of it. That's the lenient position. Now, Rabbi Lazar says back to the sages about this that, do you not concede to me that with respect to the laws of partitions, depth is the same as height? So he's basically saying, why are you going to be saying that you can have a mound inside of the vineyard that's 10 tefachim wide and 4 tefachim, 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide, but you can't have a ditch? And why are you going to just say that you can't just have a ditch here, just like the Lookout Mound? And by the way, this is why these 2 things are in the same Mishnah. And he's saying, look, don't you agree that this is a partition and that's a partition? So why aren't you treating this with the same ruling as a partition over here? And the sages say back to him, yes, we agree that depth is the same as height. However, here in this case, they're different. Why? Because the airspace of the vineyard encircles the 10 tefach deep wine press, but the airspace of the vineyard does not encircle the top of a 10 tefach high Lookout Mound. So basically what they're saying is that it's not the same because of the airspace, and there's a legal distinction. And so normally, yes, 10 tefachim high or 10 tefachim deep would be the same, except the Tanna Kama is saying, but not in this case because the airspace is like that. And that's why we have to worry about surrounding on 3 or 4 sides by vineyard if it's not done right. And that's why they care about this. So the Mishnah now looks at the 2 lenient opinions and contrasts those. Now, the sages disagree with both Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov and Rabbi Eliezer, but we want to understand what exactly is the difference between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov. Because, again, Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov says, no, you have to run a ditch through the whole vineyard. And Rabbi Eliezer is saying you don't need to run a ditch through the whole vineyard. Now, it'll turn out that Rabbi Eliezer would agree that if you ran a ditch through the whole vineyard, he would agree, and the sages would agree, you can plant within it as long as the stuff is going to be 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide. But here's where they disagree. The case is going to be, what happens if it runs through part of it? Rabbi Lazar says that you can plant inside of it, no problem. Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov says, well, if there's a vine on the 3rd side, you can't plant. He'll say that, look, if there's a work area on the 3rd side, that you can plant. That's the distinction between the Tanna Kama and these two. They're saying that the ground itself is the vineyard, whether it's a vine or not. That ground, if it's a work area, is going to be part of the vineyard. And you have to treat it like that. And you're not allowed to surround this workspace on 3 sides by a vineyard. Because the ground is a vineyard, you can't do it. Here's the difference between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov. And the Gemara is going to get into it. It's going to say that it's reasonable to assume that Rabbi Lazar, that's going to be Rabbi Akiva's teacher, who permits planting foreign seed in a wine press that's dug out inside of a vineyard, will agree with Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov that it's permitted to plant in a ditch that runs through the whole vineyard. So everybody agrees with that. You run through the whole vineyard, you're safe, you don't need to worry about it. But Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, who permits planting in a ditch that cuts through the vineyard, does not agree with Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov that is permitted to just plant in a wine press that does not run through the entire vineyard in some cases. And the Gemara is going to explain. It's going to say it's reasonable to assume that Rabbi Lazar agrees with Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov because he argued that a wine press is permissible because of the depth, and that depth is the same as the height. In other words, he's saying, look, if it's 4 tefachim high or 4 tefachim deep, you could do it. It's its own makom. And this logic is basically not going to be applied the same way by Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov. And the Gemara says Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov does not agree with Rabbi Lazar, and he's going to permit planting in a wine press that does not cut through the entire vineyard because the air space of the vineyard encircles the wine press from 3 or 4 sides. And a ditch that cuts through the entire vineyard is surrounded by the vineyard on only 2 sides. Now, again, Rabbi Lazar is saying that you can surround this pit on 4 sides, no problem. Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov says that you can surround this if one side is going to be the work area and just that blank area, and 2 sides are going to be the vines. But he'll say that if that 3rd area is a vine there, you can't do it. It's surrounded on 3 sides by a vineyard. And the Tanna Kama are going to say, no, you can't plant there at all because even if there's a vine there, you can't plant on that 3rd side. But if that blank area is part of the work area, you can't plant in there either. And that is why this is in here, to understand the distinction and nuance of the Tanna Kama's point, to understand that that ground is the vineyard. That's the novelty. This area that you use to bring your wagons or to bring your baskets to come and collect your grapes, that's part of the vineyard. It's not just the vines. And that's something that we didn't know until we got to this Mishnah. Now, the next part of the Mishnah is going to talk about the Lookout Mound inside of the vineyard. It has to be 10 tefachim high, 4 tefachim wide, and then you can plant foreign seed on top of it. There's going to be a qualification on that. Rabbi Chia says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that there must be, inside of that mound, a hollow space 4 tefachim high. Otherwise, the top surface where the foreign seed is planted appears to be connected to the vineyard below. So, in other words, that it must be at least a 4 tefach high hollow space inside of the mound, separating between the planting area on top of the mound and the ground beneath it. Now, the Gemara is going to get into the next qualification. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Rav Yitzchak says that this was stated only with respect to a round mound, and in respect to a square mound, it is not necessary for there to be a hollow space inside that's 4 tefachim high. Why? Because a round mound is not clearly seen as a separate domain that's separate from the rest of the vineyard. And it's going to blend in as part of the natural area. But a square mound clearly is the guy's lookout. That's going to be the difference. Now, there's another qualification about this that Rabbi Halafta ben Shul says there must be 3 tefachim of earth on top of the lookout above the hollow space. Why? Well, in this case, foreign seed can be planted and sown on top of that lookout only where there's 3 tefachim above it, because it's really looking like its own domain. And we saw this before with the matter used for dye, that look, if it's covered with 3 tefach of earth, it's like its own domain. And this qualification is basically saying that, look, you have inside of here a hole. It's going to be at least 4 tefachim deep. And, what did you plant inside of there? Well, you piled on at least 3 tefach of earth. And if you walk by, it has the halachic status of being its own makom because it's very much buried in its own space, just like the matter is buried in the vineyard, but it's underneath the ground. It's basically its own field. There's another qualification. Rabbi Yossi says that this too is stated only with respect to a round mound, but in the case of a square mound, it's not necessary for there to be 3 tefachim of earth on top of the lookout. In other words, that in the round mound, everybody's agreeing there has to be qualifications, and there's really not a maloket about that. The qualifications, I'm sure even Rabbi Yochanan would not disagree about. But the case of the square lookout mound where it's clearly not part of the landscape, everybody agrees that you don't need to do that. You don't need to play these games in order to make it look like it's its own domain. That's the area, that's the issue. So the Mishnah talks about the next part. It says if a grapevine is planted inside of a wine press or a cleft in the earth, that we give it a 6 tefach work area and we can plant the remainder. And Rabbi Yosef says that it has to at least be 4 amos by 4 amos, and then you can, plant foreign seed there, but if it's not, you can't. So this is a case like this, right? You have inside, there's no vineyard there. It's just a area in the ground. You've dug out, it's at least 10 tefachim deep, and it counts as its own makom down at the bottom of this pit, or well, or cleft, or wine press, whatever you want to call it. And you have 1 vine there. They want to know, well, what can you plant inside of there? Because, this is like its own domain. You have these high walls. What else can you do? Rabbi Yossi is saying that, look, unless that this area here that's 10 tefachim deep is also going to be 4 amos wide, you can't plant any foreign seed in there. And if you do, you have to set it back with a 6 tefachim work area from this 1 vine. The Tanakama are going to be saying that you can, if it's going to be at least where it's going to be 10 tefachim deep, and there's the 1 vine, you have to have at least a 6 tefach separation. And then, the question is, well, how much space do you need? They don't put as much space in there. So it's going to go like this. And the Gemara is going to elaborate on this dispute. And it says that the Mishnah is dealing with a wine press that is from 3 or 4 tefachim wide. And if it's less than 3 tefachim wide, it's considered as if it's sealed. And then a vine planted in it would be viewed as if it's planted on level ground. And then you have to put distancing of 6 tefachim, and everybody would agree with that. Now, the idea is a sealed wine press is not viewed as a distinct domain. And so Rabbi Kanievsky, in explaining this, is saying that a sealed wine press or cleft requires distancing of 6 tefachim in all directions when you're going to plant foreign seed, even when planting on ground alongside of it. And so that's the nuance here. So it's saying that, look, if it's going to be less than 3 or 4 tefachim, it's going to be like this vine is on level ground, and from all directions you have to set it back for foreign seed at least 6 tefachim. Now, basically it's nullifying this and saying, well, it's not part of a partition. This is not really partitioned off. It's like it doesn't matter if it's in a pit, that this vine is really like if it's on level ground and you have to separate it in all directions. It continues, and the Gemara says that in contrast of a wine press or a cleft, where it's going to be from 3 or 4 tefachim wide, it's permissible to plant inside of the wine press or cleft, and that's going to be the maloket between the Tanakh and Rabbi Yossi when you're going to be trying to plant outside of the wine press or cleft. Now, if you have inside of there a 4 tefachim wide ditch, can you do a 6 tefach setback inside and plant inside of the ditch? No. Why? Because, okay, it's deep, it's 10 tefachim deep, and very good, it counts as its own makom, but basically you can't plant anything else inside of that ditch. You can't fit it. And in the case of Rabbi Yossi is giving a novelty. Rabbi Yossi is saying you can plant inside of the ditch if it's going to be at least 4 almost wide by 4 almost wide, because now you have a 6 tefach work area and you can plant something else inside of it. That's a novelty. But the case of the Tanakh is going to be different, because they're going to be saying that you can't fit anything else inside of it. And now, even though this is going to count like its own makom, you still have a setback that you have to do. That's going to be the difference. So the Gemara is going to say that one distance is from the edge enough to complete 4 tefachim together with the width of the wine press or cleft, and then you can plant seed immediately thereafter. So over here, since the wine press or the cleft is not considered as if it's sealed, then it's going to constitute its own domain. It's going to be separate from the surrounding area. And in respect to planting inside the wine press, that's going to be where you're going to have a stringency. Rabbi Yossi is going to rule in this case that the entire closed area becomes subordinate to the grapevine. On the other hand, in respect to sowing the ground outside of the wine press or cleft, this is going to be a case of leniency, where the vine is going to be situated in a self-contained domain, and it's going to be considered separate from the ground outside the wine press or cleft, and it's not necessary to distance foreign seed planted in the wine press or surrounding ground 6 tefachim from the vine. So because the wine press or cleft lacks the minimum width of 4 tefachim, that's going to categorize a distinct legal domain. You have to distance the seed from the wine press of the cleft enough to complete a 4 tefach minimum measure. So why is it saying in here 3 or 4 tefachim? Well, because maybe it's 3.5 tefachim. Okay, but it's not talking about a 4 tefach area. 4 tefach area, that's going to be 4 tefach wide and 10 tefach deep, that's its own makom. And over here, if we're going to be dealing with something that's going to be less than that, then you're basically, if you're going to be planting on top of the ground, you have to treat it like it's not its own makom. It means you have to do a setback of 6 tefachim. And the Mishnah is teaching the next clause about the house, and the Gemara is going to cite a scriptural support for the Mishnah's ruling, and it's going to say, Rabbi Avin said in the name of Shmuel that the verse says, and in prison houses they were hidden. This is in Isaiah 42:22, where it says Bet Kelei, and also Kilayim is going to be like Bete Kilayim, which is going to be the plural of prison houses, and a cell and Kilayim are basically going to be vowelized in a similar way with the same letters. And it's basically going to be alluding to that a case where you have a house where you're going to be hiding Kilayim, and a house inside of a vineyard where it's going to be permitted to plant foreign seeds. So the very fact that foreign seed is hidden inside of a house, inside of a vineyard, that's going to be where this is a scriptural allusion, an asmata to firm up this law that you can plant within a house that's walled off from the rest of a vineyard. So have a great day, and we're learning the laws of Kilayim.